All right, hello everybody. Welcome to the first full week of lecture in victimology. This week we will be covering chapter 1 of our textbook, and we're going to be looking at what is victimology and what is a victim. So if you've never taken an online class from me, I will give you the same spiel that I give all of my online classes, and that is you have access to this PowerPoint. You can follow along as I'm going along, take notes as you see fit. I would strongly encourage you to take notes as we go through. There will be some things that I talk about that may not be on the slides, but still be important enough for you to know as you're going through. So make sure that you're paying attention as you're going through. I will also have this time stamped so that you will be able to go back to sections that you may have missed or need to rehear. All right, with that, let's go to our next slide. Okay, so as we start, I want to ask you a question. If you had $18 billion, what would you do with it? And that's billion with a B. So just imagine, if you had $18 billion with no strings attached, what would you do with it? Would you maybe buy a house? Maybe pay off student debt? Maybe go on a dream vacation? How about spending it on people you don't know? Would you randomly go up to a stranger and give them $1 million? The reason I ask this question is because we spend approximately $18 billion a year on victims of crime. What you thought you would do with the money? So why is this important? In the United States, recent estimates of the number of crime victims, including violent and personal crime and property crime, reach as high as 22 million cases a year. That's a lot of victims. Victim compensation, which you'll learn more about throughout the semester, spends about $500 million. But you can see the total economic losses attributed to violent crime and property crimes. So you'll see that property crimes tend to be a little bit higher as far as economic losses because of the nature of that crime. It's property crime. So some of that crime can't be, some of the valuables that are lost in that crime and those types of crimes cannot be gotten. So what is victimology? Well, I can tell you that you've probably had several different classes in your criminal justice career, and the majority of your criminal justice classes have looked at crimes through the lens of the offender. Well, in victimology, we're going to flip that script on its head. We will be looking at crime through the lens of the victim, and it is not a pretty sight. Our system, you will find, as we kind of go on through this lecture, that our system is not necessarily kind to victims. So victimology itself originated after World War II. It emerged in the 40s and 50s as a distinct and viable field of study. We have a lot of debate on whether it can stand on its own two legs or if it falls under the field of criminology. The general consensus is victimology does not need to stand on its own 2 feet, that it can be a subsection of criminology and criminal justice. So we know that criminology is the scientific study of crime, right? You've all had criminology classes. Well, victimology is the study of victims. And more importantly, it's the social structural way of viewing crime, the law, the criminal, and the victim. So in victimology, we will be looking not only at the victim, but of the geospatial criminal acts. We'll be looking at offender dynamics with victims, as well as how the system treats victims. So victimology kind of wraps everything that you've done up into a bow and adds the victim's lens to the conversation. So what does it mean to be a victim? I want you to sit and just think for a minute. And if I asked you this question, what does it mean to be a victim? What's your answer? Some people may immediately come at that question through a criminal justice and criminology lens and say, well, being a victim means that someone perpetrated something against me. Well, I'm going to ask you to stretch that definition as we go through. The term victim is derived from the Latin term victima and originally contained the concept of sacrifice. When we talk about victims now, we're talking about crime victims. A lot of times, we're talking about crime victims. So a crime victim refers to a person, organization, or business that has been directly harmed as a result of the commission of an offense. Now that definition and that harm can be physical, it can be emotional, or it can be financial. But when we're talking about victims in a sense, we typically are referencing crime victims, and we typically associate the overall term of victim to crime victims. But that might not necessarily be the best way to determine victimhood. Early victimologists really kind of focused um, their studies on attempting to determine typologies of victimhood and what is a victim. A lot of the early victimologists really set out to determine a profile for a victim based on certain situational interpersonal dynamics. The first major breakthrough in victimology came from Mendelssohn. And Mendelssohn developed 4 fundamental criteria of victimhood, what it means to have been victimized. And so these 4 we're going to go over. The first is the nature of the determinant that causes the suffering. Now that's a lot of big words put together, but essentially it means in order for someone to experience victimhood, they have to have experienced some type of suffering. And that suffering may be physical, psychological, or both depending on the trauma. There's some sense of suffering because of the situation that happened. The next is the whole entire social character of suffering itself. So suffering is a reaction from the victim and from the offender themselves. So suffering originates in the victim and others' reactions to the event. So you have some type of suffering, then you have a reaction to that suffering, and then we look at the importance of the social factors that come with victimhood. And the social factors are basically social implications of the injurious acts that can have greater impact, sometimes even more severe than the physical or psychological harm. So in Mendelssohn's mind, he developed this concept of victimhood that focused on having suffering done to you, some type of physical, emotional trauma, the reaction or the societal views of that suffering to the victim, and then the stigmatization from that trauma that follows throughout the life course. And so the best way I know how to describe that is if you throw if you throw a rock into a pond, what happens? There's a ripple effect. And so you may have heard of the ripple effect before, but essentially the concept of victimhood is like the ripple effect. So throwing the rock into the pond is essentially the act of victimization. And it causes immediate suffering. The victim perceives the suffering, just as when you throw the rock into the water contorts. And so the water recognizes that there is a foreign object and contorts. So the victim recognizes that they have been victimized. But then the ripples go out from the place of where the rock was thrown. And so those societal factors are like the ripples. And so being a victim can cause sometimes more severe effects in the long term. Psychologically, there may be some type of damage that the victim has to kind of work through going forward and things like that. And finally, according to Mendelssohn, the concept of victimhood, based on this suffering, leads to the victim having an inferiority complex. And basically, the inferiority complex manifests itself as a feeling of submission. So we will talk about more recent kind of typologies and victim precipitation. But essentially, in 1976, Mendelssohn is saying victimhood has psychological effects that are long lasting to those who fall to victimization. They may not trust going out. They may not trust people. So if you have ever skateboarded and you fall off that skateboard and you get hurt, you're going to have serious trust issues getting back on that skateboard because you're going to feel like you're going to get hurt again. Same thing with victimhood. If someone is walking down the street at night and they get robbed, they're going to have an inferiority complex or be submissive, always looking over their back and have this stigma of maybe that street, that time of day being alone, things like that, that are psychological scars that go through the rest of their life course. And so early studies kind of molded how we think of victimhood because of this concept that Mendelssohn set forth. Let's look at contemporary terminology. The term victim now implies a wide range of circumstances of human suffering, and it includes victims of deliberate self-harm. So interpersonal violence, we think of victims during times of war, genocide, white-collar crimes. The justice system in and of itself can perpetrate victimhood. So you see that the term victim is not just crime victim, but it's a broader sense of victimhood. If we go back to what Mendelssohn was saying, some suffering that has been endured that causes some type of lasting effect on the person's psyche, that society recognizes as having some implication. You can make the term victim more broad and not as narrow as just crime victims. So let's look at a couple of examples of crime victims and victimhood. We're going to look at victims of personal and property crime. So personal crime is defined by the NCVS, which is the National Crime Victim Survey. You'll learn about that in week 4, I believe, if you don't already know that. But personal crimes are those crimes against a person. They have some sense of personal attack to the victim. So you have rape, you have robbery, you have assault, you have personal larceny. Property crimes do not usually involve the presence of a victim. Sometimes we think of property crimes as being victimless crimes or not necessarily having a victim at the time of the crime being committed. So you're thinking about like theft, graffiti, damage to property, things like that are property crimes. You also have white-collar crimes that can fall into some realm of property crimes. So, are victims of crime the only victims in the scenario? I want you to take a minute and think about that. So if we have personal crimes or we have property crimes that are happening, the person who is targeted specifically in those crimes is considered a victim. But are there other victims because of that victimization? You have an answer? So this is where I talked about earlier about expanding our thoughts around victimhood. There are victims of non-criminal harm. So this is victims that are outside of the domain of crime. So you've heard of victimless crimes. Some property crimes could be victimless crime, thought of as victimless crimes, but when you're talking about victimless crimes, you're really kind of talking about white collar crimes. So embezzlement, larceny, cyber crimes, things like that. But you also have victims of social harms. So can someone be a victim of, say, pollution? Can someone be a victim of environmental harm? We don't think of ourselves as being victims of like pollution, climate change, things like that, but I know if you're anywhere in the United States, you kind of see we have some crazy weather that some people can attribute it back to climate change. And so because of that climate change happening, it could make our weather a little bit more severe than we're used to. Therefore, you have severe tornadoes, you have tsunamis, you have massive flooding that damages property. Are those victims per se? Absolutely. Also have victims in the sense of state actions that violate national and international law while in the pursuit of economic and political ends. Political victimization, essentially. All of this kind of helps us broaden our definition of victim. And that's why at the very beginning I talked about when we in a criminal justice setting talk about victims, we're really kind of talking about crime victims. And there is a difference. But overall, victimhood is a much broader area than one might think, because You can be a victim of non-criminal acts, such as political victimization, such as climate change, those social harms, policies, procedures that organizations put in place can harm or victimize people. The answer to that question was absolutely. Are victims of crime the only victims? No. So with that being said, I want you to take a look at these three pictures. And I want you to answer this question. Who's more likely to be a victim? You have Denise, who is a 20-year-old college student living right off campus in an apartment by herself for the first time. Then you have Gladys, who is a 75-year-old woman who lives in a pretty upscale apartment, has significant amounts of money that she kind of flaunts around town. And then you have Darius, who is a 22-year-old African-American male. He lives in a lower socioeconomic neighborhood, has his household was raised by a single mother. Darius be into some not so pleasant things to make money. He potentially is a member of a gang. So out of these three people and scenarios, who is more likely to be a victim based on what we know and based on what you've read? So here's what we know. We're going to work through this together. Sorry for I'm writing down timestamps so that I know to get these sections together for you. So we know that there is no standard victim profile. Here and say that if you check this box, and this box, then you're most likely going to be a victim of a crime. I can't say that. However, through the works of victimologists, and we'll talk more about victimology theory next week, that kind of helps shape our understanding of victimhood and what it means to be a victim. We do know that there are certain characteristics that are more likely than not to increase victimization. So lifestyle choices, your location, and your race all play major components in potential victimization. So the question was, Darius is most likely to become a victim of crime. What we know is young, mostly 16 to 24-year-olds, black males living in urban high crime areas are your most likely profile to be victimized. Now, does that surprise you? It might surprise you because our media's depiction of victimhood has painted victimhood in a sense that has given us a false pretense on what it means to be a victim. So if you turn on Law and Order SVU, or you turn on any Law and Order, you're probably going to say the young college girl is probably more likely to be a victim because she's alone in a big college town, and she doesn't know anybody, and she's a pretty little girl. Or you might have chosen Gladys, who was an older lady who had a lot of money that flaunted. And so you might think, well, she's rich, so people are going to hit her with property crime or robbery or something like that. When in all actuality, it comes down to the decisions that influence the environmental and social factors that lead to victimhood. And race plays a uncanny cause in victimhood. So crime affects everyone, not just the victim. There are three types of victims when we talk about crime victims. The first type of victim is your primary victim. This is a person, organization, or business that has been directly harmed as a result of the commission of an offense. I go up and I punch somebody in the face, that person is a victim of me punching them in the face, right? I committed assault and battery. However, there is something known as a secondary victim as well. And a secondary victim is that victim's friends and family. Friends and family are also victimized by crime and crime victimhood. The primary victim may have the bumps and bruises, the physical, the psychological effects of crime. However, the family and close friends of that victim are also going to feel the effects of crime. That victim may have to rely on family and friends to take them to doctors, to take them to court and criminal justice events, may have to have them live with them for a while, may have to be there to reassure them. So victims are not just primary victims, they're also secondary victimization in the inner circle. And then finally, you have a tertiary victim, which is your community victimization. So if I ran up and punched somebody in the face, I've caused them to become a victim. Their family will feel the effects of that victimhood, but that community is also going to feel the effects of that victimhood because crime rate will increase because I have assaulted someone in a neighborhood. So that neighborhood is going to feel the effects of crime. People may feel uncomfortable going out of their environments. So think back to the 70s and 80s when serial killers were popular, and there were a lot of them. You saw a lot of tertiary victimhood in that the communities were scared. They may not have been primary victims, but they were tertiary victims because you turned on the news and you saw someone else being killed in your neighborhood. Oh my, what if that's me? I don't know if any of you were alive during the DC sniper shooting, but those were some freaky times. People being shot walking down the street, people being shot filling up on gas, people being shot running in the park, just random victimization. That created tertiary victimhood of the community. People in that community having undue stress and undue trauma of the what ifs. Like, I can't go to the grocery store without being fearful that I'm going to get murdered. So that's what a tertiary victim is. So I've hinted at this a little bit. Promulgated lies to you when it comes to victimhood, probably. In fact, victimhood and crime sells, right? So you have all kinds of crime drama shows. You have turn on the news. You're seeing wars going on. You're seeing all kinds of scary things, right? But how do we truly measure victimhood? And how do we truly measure crime? So you should know this, but if you don't, Crime data is collected through national surveys that help construct a partial picture of crime and victimhood longitudinally. So we gather data from previous years to kind of inform us how crime rates have either increased or decreased or stayed the same, things like that. Generally, data on crime rates show a sharp rise in crime after 1963 until the early 90s. And realistically, crime rates have decreased since the 90s. Now you have some pockets of, again, locations that may see some increases in certain types of crimes, but your book goes over some really great crime trends that you should probably pay attention to. So we know that simple assault makes up 64% of all violent crimes. So simple assault is me going up and punching someone in the nose. Does that surprise you that that makes up all the the majority of violent crimes? It shouldn't. Not everyone's out here murdering someone. The majority of our violent crimes have to do with assault and battery. Aggravated assault makes up 16%, robbery 11%, and rape and sexual assault only make up 9% of overall crime. To talk about the NCVS in a lot more detail, these are all data sources from the NCVS. The NCVS gives us probably the most accurate prediction of crime victimization that there is, and you'll kind of learn more about why. You should know a little bit about the UCR and the NIBRS and things like that, kind of some of their strengths and weaknesses, but the NCVS is really kind of what we utilize to measure crime. Victimhood, I should say. So we've talked about what victimhood means. We've talked about what it means to truly kind of enhance our knowledge of the term victim. We've talked about some trends in crime. We've talked about some of the early works of trying to figure out typologies of victimization. So now let's turn our attention to the cost and consequences of crime. So remember when I said victimology, we're looking at the system through the lens of the victim and the offender and the geospatial locations of crime and things like that. So a lot of this class is going to look at crime through those different lenses. So you will see me referencing crimes through offender lenses as well, and that shouldn't confuse you too much, because there is a steady dynamic between victims and offenders. You will learn about victim precipitation and kind of the victim's role in their own victimhood, and that's a pretty common occurrence, and it's something that students have a really tough time wrapping their heads around, because victimology can come off as victim blaming, and it, in a lot of ways it is, and in a lot of ways there is some culpability in victimization from the victim themselves, but then you'll see it's kind of like it's a scale. And so how much of their own victimhood do they cause? However, No one can understate that becoming a victim of crime, whether you are a primary, secondary, or tertiary victim, there are significant consequences and costs associated with that. And we look at cost in the terms of direct tangible cost and intangible cost. So according to the National Institute of Justice, direct tangible costs are roughly around $105 billion. And intangible costs are roughly around $450 billion. So we have health, we're going to break this down a little bit. We have health-related costs that are direct tangible costs. Health-related expenses incur due to the crime. So this is the direct cost of injuries or damages sustained by becoming a victim. So you can have immediate injuries, you can have injuries that leave visible scars, you can have injuries that you don't know how long it's going to take to heal from, or you can have long-term catastrophic injuries such as like paralyzation. Those health-related costs go into direct tangible cost. We can see the money that you put in to your health care because of the victimization itself. A direct financial cost, and this is different than healthcare cost because financial cost may be you have lost or damaged property. You had to lose hours at work because you were victimized. You had to lose time from school. And then just the criminal justice cost itself. Like, it's not cheap to put on a trial. It's not cheap to bring in expert witnesses. It's not cheap to move a court docket along. So you have all of these tangible costs that are increased because of victimization. Then you have the intangible cost of victimization. And the intangible cost, the best way I know to describe intangible cost is like your psychological effects of being a victim. And intangible costs are the most significant consequences of crime. Your psychological effects of being a victim is the most significant consequence that happens because of the crime. So some common costs are psychological distress, which we've talked about, trauma that you've incurred from going through that experience, and then the overall fear of crime. If you've become a victim, we're going to talk about double victimization and poly-victimization and things like that. But if you have become a victim once, you're more likely to become a victim of more crime. And so an intangible cost of victimization really is this ongoing fear of crime and of ongoing victimhood and things like that. So you see a lot of the fear of crime, not only with the primary victim, but again with the tertiary victim. Your chapter talks about a college survey done by Fox and colleagues in 2009 around college campuses. And it was around sexual abuse and this increased fear of victimization with college females. That's really the best visual I can give you when it comes to fear of crime and that intangible psychological cost. You saw that because they had heard about these types of crimes going on, there was an increased fear that they would become a victim of those crimes. And that kind of always lingered in the background. All right, that is going to conclude week one's lesson. I hope that I kind of cleared some of this up for you. As always, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. My office hours are now posted. Make sure you go through the modules, watch the videos that I post. I post videos that help kind of dive into some of these topics a little bit more in depth. Some people are visual learners, and videos kind of help them visualize what the concepts that we're talking about. So make sure you watch those. Read the introduction, the module introduction. It kind of tells you some of the highlights of the chapter and things like that. So if you need anything, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day.